pastors in this church. Only Hannah, right? Only Hannah. So there's a lot of what do you say? There's a lot of expectations on pastors' kids. There's a lot of
unfair expectations.
Unfair expectations.
Yes.
Stereotypes of pastors' kids. And Jim back there. So Hannah's not the only one. So sorry about that. I'm not leaving you out. So, but anyway, we're glad he's here. And Brother Gerald's dad was a preacher and started a church at, what was that church? Grace Baptist Church. And we're just glad to have him be part of our congregation. He'll be bringing the word today. Brother Gerald.
All right, we'll see if I can do this without breaking anything. Now, my laptop says I have 4 hours of battery life, so I might not have enough battery life to do this whole message, but we'll see. So let me make sure all those things are doing what I want them to do. All right, so open your Bibles up. We're going to look at Daniel 11 first. Daniel chapter 11. While you're turning there, let me tell you a funny story. We're obviously looking at Esther some too, but a few years ago, I had a friend on Facebook that took one of these tests that said, which book of the Bible are you? And her answer was Esther. The problem is that she wrote and posted, there's no book of Esther. So I had to remind her, and I wrote to her and I said, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and the sad part is she went to the same Christian school I went to in high school. She's a little older than me, so maybe her age got to her, I don't know. But all right, so Daniel chapter 11, we're going to look at verses 2 through 4, so just a couple verses. So starting with verse 2. And now I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength through his riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others besides those. So this is a brief history of the Persian Empire. These are all the different kings of the Persian Empire. Up there on the screen, so let me tell you about a few of them. We have Cyrus the Great. He was the founder of the Mede-Persian Empire. At one point, this empire had 50 million people, so it's a very large empire. It covered over 3 million square miles, so this was no small kingdom at all. He's also the king who allowed the Jews to return home after 70 years of captivity. Then we have Cambyses, who was the son of Cyrus. He conquered Egypt. That's a pretty big conquering. He conquered all of Egypt. The next king we have here is Darius. He's the son-in-law of Cyrus the Great. He had defeated 9 kings and 19 battles in the span of just 2 years. So it's a lot of conquering. He actually conquered many regions of Greece, but he couldn't gain control over all Greece. In fact, he lost a lot of areas of Greece in the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. His fourth king we have is Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus. This is the person we saw in 11:2. That was one of the richest kings. He is Darius' son. Xerxes, again, also known as Ahasuerus, he continued in the same steps of his dad. He went to conquer things, had large armies, huge armies. And so, in fact, in 481 BC, he wanted to go take over Greece, but he failed. Even though his army was much larger, he was outsmarted by the Greeks. The Greeks just went into smaller areas with all these ships and fought against them. So, when you have more people, if you can get into a small area, they can attack all your ships if you hide them all. That's kind of what happened there. And these last two we see here, Artaxerxes is the son of Xerxes. He was also the cupbearer. Nehemiah was his cupbearer, and he's the king who allowed Nehemiah to go back and rebuild the walls. And then lastly, the king you see there in red is the one you should know of, Alexander the Great. He's the one mentioned in those verses 3 and 4 that does all the conquering of the Persian Empire. That happened in 334 BC, and that was under King Darius III. So those are lots of kings of the Persian Empire. And do we know what Persia is called today? It's Iran. That's what Persia is today. This is the map of the entire empire. It's no small area, right? We've got going from India, just at the border of India, all the way over to Libya. So this is a huge empire. It is absolutely massive. So that brings us here to Esther, the true story of Esther. So what you need to know here before we start reading Esther is that at this time Jerusalem had been conquered many times. They kept raiding it. So Jerusalem was destroyed. So all of these Jews are fleeing Jerusalem. And one of the places they end up is in the Persian Empire. And most of the people that flee end up becoming slaves, So they're slaves to the kings. They're just slaves, or they have low-level jobs. They're basically what you would say is just a nobody, right? Which I love that song, by the way. But that's how the Jews end up, just fleeing, and they're all in exile. And so this fourth king I mentioned, Xerxes Ahasuerus, is the king with Esther. And so let's look at a little background on Esther. Her name means star in Persian. Her Greek name was also Hadassah, which means myrtle. And that's that tree I have up there. It's an evergreen shrub used for violet flowers and also for making perfume. And a flower from the myrtle bush is a symbol of love, and it's also the Hebrew emblem for marriage. Esther seems to have grown up in Shushan, which is the central area of the Persian Empire. And she was raised by her cousin Mordecai after both her parents had died. We don't know how they died. Esther's father was Abihai, which was Mordecai's uncle, so they're cousins. The Book of Esther was probably written, I don't have this on the screen, but the Book of Esther was probably written either by Ezra, Mordecai, or Nehemiah. Not completely sure, but someone who would have been very familiar with all the Jewish traditions and all the things going on then. Something that you may also know is that God is not mentioned anywhere in the entire book of Esther. Neither is the word pray or prayer. But we do see that there's much fasting going on. And also Esther is not mentioned anywhere else in the entire Bible. So Esther chapter 1 happens in about 483 BC. King Ahasuerus, as I mentioned, is also Xerxes. He's building up his army. He wants to go and attack Greece again and take over Greece. And he wants to do the things his father did. So what he's done is he has this big summit meeting with all the leaders of that great land and the great empire. They are all coming together to meet and talk about how we can conquer Greece. So that's what they're doing. And this meeting is going on for about 6 months. So when this meeting concludes, the king hosts a huge 7-day party. And that brings us to the first chapter of Esther and the Feast of Ahasuerus. So look over to verse 1 of Esther chapter 1. This is what happens. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This is the Ahasuerus which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. That in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign he made feast unto all the princes and servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes and provinces being before him. So a lot of people have come to this party. You think about how many people are coming there. He's got a lot of different leaders, a lot of different regions. You think about in the United States how many governors and mayors and just different leaders we have. This is kind of a similar thing. All these people are coming together to the central area of their kingdom. So now the party is ending, and we have a 7-day. I'm going ahead of myself. This party's ending, and now we have the seventh day. Go look at Esther 1:10. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mecham, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abitha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princess her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore the king was very wroth, and his anger burned in him. So here the king has this huge party. It's the last day, the party's coming to an end, and what's he want to do? He wants to go in there and have his wife basically come and show off. And what's she do? She says, no way. I have my own party over here. I'm not leaving. Whatever her reason was, she didn't come. Well, that's huge. You don't disrespect the king. And surely not if you're the queen, you don't disrespect the queen. So then the next thing they want to do is if you go down to verse 15, I'm going to read that one. In verse 15, the king asked his friends, what should I do? What is going on here? And so verse 16, he gets counsel from one of his chamberlains, or one of his men. In verse 16, and Micam answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princesses and all the people that are in the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. So his response is, hey, guess what? Not only did he disrespect you, she disrespected all of the men in this entire region, because if you don't do anything against her and punish her, all of these women are going to revolt. They're not going to listen to any of the men. That's basically what he tells the king. So then we go down to verse 19. We see the king's response. He basically says, yeah, I agree with you. So we'll look at verse 19 through 22. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him. Let it be written among the laws of Persians and Medes, that it not be altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. And when the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all the empire, for it is great. All the wives shall give their husbands honor, both great and small. And the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king according to the word of Mimicum. For he sent letters into all the king's provinces, and every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. So here we see the king issues this decree that gets sent out to everybody. Guess what? Men are in charge. You need to listen to them. You need to do what they tell you to do. And which is with Scripture, right? That really is Scripture, as long as it's done as unto the Lord. But that's what's happened. So now the king removes her. Just catch on my slides there. So the king removes her as queen. We saw that in verse 19. So then we have this Esther. So if we look at, they're going to search for Vashti's replacement. So if we look at Esther 2:2, it says, Then said the king's servant that ministered unto him, Let there be fair young virgins sought for the king, and let the maidens which please the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. So here there's going to be, hopefully you're familiar with the story, they're going to bring in all the beautiful women that are available to the king, and the king's going to pick. And so at this time, it's estimated there are probably 25 million women in the Persian Empire, and they estimate they've only brought about 400. Because, of course, not all 25 million would have been single and available. But that's a lot of people that they chose from. And if you go down to verse 8, we see that Esther gains a friend. In verse 8, his name is Haggai. He's the keeper of women. And then we see in verse 9 how he treats Esther. And it says here in verse 9, And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. And he speedily gave her things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were meet to given her. Out of the king's house he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. And verse 10, Esther had not showed her people, nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. So verse 9, we see how she gets treated by the keeper of women. Treats her great because he likes her. And in verse 10, we learn that Esther was told by Mordecai not to tell anybody that you're a Jew. Because as I mentioned, Jews are looked down upon. So they do not care for the Jews, as you'll see here in a moment. So, and none of this happened by random chance, right? I mean, she just suddenly finds this keeper of women who gives her all these things. No, this is all within God's plan. So this whole contest, for lack of a better term, goes on for about a year. So this doesn't just happen overnight. And going back to the first chapter, I meant to mention, one of those verses, I think it's like verse 5 or 6, says that it was in the 3rd year of King Ahasuerus' reign that all those things took place. We'll see here in a moment. In verse 16, if you go down to that, Esther 2:16. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month of Tabith, in the 7th year of his reign. So if chapter 1 is the 3rd year of the king's reign, chapter 2 we're on the 7th year. There's 4 years since Vashti was removed as king or queen. 4 years have passed. It didn't just happen all of a sudden. What most people think is that happened is, if you look at history, the king actually went into battle with the Greece, so he wasn't in the Persian Empire ready to pick a queen. He was in the midst of battle. So they waited before they had this event. So we have 4 years after that. So go down to verse 17. It says, "And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he had set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti." So again, this was not a small contest. And she has now, Esther, this girl who had no parents really, they died when she was young, raised by Mordecai, doesn't seem to have a motherly figure in her life whatsoever, and she's going to win a beauty contest. I mean, that's pretty amazing. That really is truly God's providence. And so we know they live happily ever after, right? No, that doesn't happen. So go down to verse 2. And we're going to see what happens with Mordecai. Mordecai is sitting outside the gates one day, and he happens to hear a conversation going on. We'll look at that, verse 21 through 23 of Esther chapter 2. "In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Tereus, of which those kept the door, were wroth, and sought to lay the hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen. And Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name." In verse 23, "And when the inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of Chronicles before the king." So Mordecai hears them plotting to kill the king. He tells Esther. Esther tells the king. The king, they do an investigation. They find out, yeah, Mordecai's right. So they immediately go find these two guys and they hang them. Sometimes we wish maybe there were punishments that happen that quickly in the world today. I mean, when things like this happen, that can deter sin, right? So, and this is a very important thing that happens, as we're going to see in a moment if you don't already know. But then we have kind of the opposite happening here. Haman wants to murder the Jews. So turn over to chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. "After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him, and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor gave him reverence." So here Haman gets a promotion. We're not told why he gets this promotion, but he seems to be a guy who wants to be a leader, who is going to just get things done. And the king needs that, because the king's focused on war. So he wants someone to help him accomplish what needs to be done within Shushan. So, but then, if we go down, and then we see that the king, in fact, tells people, bow down to Haman. Bow down to him as well. So that's a huge promotion for the king to tell everybody else, bow down to Haman. But if we go down to verse 5, we start to see the kind of man that Haman really is. And so Esther 3:5, "And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai." So here Haman hates it that Mordecai is not bound down to him. Probably already hates the Jews because they're already looked down upon. And so he's thinking, I want to kill all these Jews. All of them in the entire kingdom of Ahasuerus. That's what Haman wants to happen. So that's the reason why he did these things. So if we look down to verse 8, we're going to see how Haman's going to try to accomplish this. "And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, There are certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep the king's laws, therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hand of those that have charge of business, to bring it into the king's treasures." So here Haman just goes to the king and says, basically, there's people out there that are not obeying your laws. How about we just kill them? And the king basically believes Haman. Doesn't seem to really care because, again, I think he's focused more on wars. He tells Haman, they're not obeying my laws. That's fine. Go ahead. Let's do this decree. You just go ahead and destroy these people. And so, the king really is not. How can you just sit there and say, let's kill a whole bunch of people and not really know who they are? Because at this point, he really doesn't care. It was just sad, right? So then we have, if you go down to verse 12, we see that this decree gets published. Let's read verse 12. Then were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month, and there was written according to all Haman had commanded, unto the king's lieutenants, and to the governors that were every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province according to the writing thereof. And to every people after their language, in the name of King Ahasuerus was it written, and sealed it with the king's ring. So here Haman gets the king's ring, he seals it, and he sends this out to all the people, basically saying, hey, you guys can go kill the Jews. That's the official decree. So then we have the response of the Jews. Turn over to chapter 4. Just turn to chapter 4 and read along. I have a, hopefully this works okay. So Jim, be ready to mute some sound. I might have to do it. This is a dramatic reading of Esther chapter 4. I got it, Jim. Hold on. There we go.
When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and cried with a loud and bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate. For none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told it her. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai, and to take away his sackcloth from him, but he received it not. Then called Esther for Hatak, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and gave him a commandment to Mordecai to know what it was and why it was. So Hathach went forth to Mordecai unto the street of the city, which was before the king's gate. And Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him, and of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. Also he gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and to declare it unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king, to make supplication unto him, and to make request before him for her people. And Hatak came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Again Esther spake unto Hatak, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his, to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him.
That's Esther chapter 4. So just to briefly summarize here, we see Mordecai's sorrow. Esther's maid and sees Mordecai out there just weeping. And she doesn't really know what the relationship is between Mordecai and Esther, but she knows that Esther must care about Mordecai. So she tells him, hey, he's out there, he's just weeping, he's crying, and he has rented his clothes, which is, you're not supposed to be out in front of the kingdom not dressed very well, especially not with your clothes all torn up and in mourning. So she sends one of the guards, a man named Hatak, to give Mordecai some clothes, but he refuses. And then so Mordecai tells Esther what's going on. He has that decree sent to Esther. Oh, I went too far. Has that decree sent to Esther. 1 second, sorry. My thing messed up. There we go. He has that decree sent to Esther, and they go back and forth, and effectively, Mordecai says, Esther, you have to go see the king. And Esther says, wait, I haven't seen the king for 30 days. If I go there without permission, he can have me immediately killed. Which sounds ridiculous, but one of the reasons they had this rule was so they would have intruders sometimes go in and try to kill the king. So they knew if you went in there and you had no permission, you were dead if the king wanted it that way. So that's what happens here. So what Esther responds and tells him is, hey, I'll do this, but you have to pray. You need to fast. She didn't, pray is not in here, but you have to fast day and night. And we know if you're a Christian, when you hear the word fasting, the first thing you think of is praying. Because otherwise, why would you be fasting? For health? Well, you can fast for health, but you should do it through prayer. Right? That's what the Lord wants us to do, to trust in Him. So if we go down, though, I do want to read verse 12 and 13. I know we just heard it. 12 and 13. And they told Mordecai Esther's words, and then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house, more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall be an enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Mordecai's like, basically, if you don't do this, what, you're going to live probably in the kingdom, but your father's house, all these people you know you grew up with, they're going to be dead. So he encourages her, you must go and see the king. And of course, Esther agrees. And Esther's bravery here, to me, reminds me of the verse John 15:13 that tells us, greater love hath no man than this, that he may lay down his life for his friends. And if we go back to verse, I'm doing it again here. All right, verse 15 of chapter 4, but I got to bring my thing up too. Sorry. Verse 15, chapter 4, and 15 and 16. Then Esther bade them return Mordecai with this answer, go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also send and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. Some great words they have from Esther, who knows it's possible she could be killed for something going before the king. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all Esther had commanded them. So finally we get to chapter 5, the triumph of the Jews. So if we look here, she's going to go before the king, and the first time she goes before the king is in verse 3. And let's read that. Chapter 5, verse 3. Then said the king unto her, what wilt thou, Queen Esther? And what is thy request? It shall be even given to thee half of the kingdom. And Esther answered, if it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day into the banquet I prepared for him. Then the king said, cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther hath said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Then answered Esther and said, my petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition, and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said. So here Esther goes before the king. And if you never read the story before, you think perhaps she's going to tell him right away what's going on, but she doesn't. She says, hey, you know what, tonight come to dinner with me, and we'll just have dinner. And king asks her again, well, what do you want? And he says, I'll give you half the kingdom. And again, I showed you how big this kingdom was. That's no small thing. He tells her that twice. But then Esther says, come to a banquet tomorrow. You know, you're like, wait, why is he waiting? But if we'll read further here, we'll see why. It's actually God's great providence. The two things that happened that same night, the night before the banquet. Go down to verse 9, Esther 5:9. Then went Haman forth that day, joyful with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, then he stood not up nor moved for him. He was full of indignation against Mordecai. So we'll go all the way down to verse 14. Haman goes home. He goes home and he sees his wife and his friends, his family. Here's what happens in verse 14. Then saith Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends unto him, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go in merrily with the king into the banquet, and the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. So here his family, basically his wife, telling him, build these gallows to kill this Mordecai who won't bow down to you. And in fact, tell the king tomorrow at this banquet that you're going to. Little does Haman know, right? So, King Ahasuerus can't sleep one night. Amazingly, it happens to be the same night that Haman's going to plan to kill Mordecai. So let's go over to chapter 6. Chapter 6, we'll look at verses 1 through 3. On that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of Chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was found written that Mordecai had told the Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor and dignity has been done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, nothing has been done. There's nothing done for him. So this is that story we read in the second chapter, where Mordecai heard about these two people going to kill the king. And kings in this time were meticulous about when someone did something for them, they would record it and they would reward them. And so because they wanted people to love them, as mean as some of these were sometimes. And so the king has them read this because they can't sleep. And if you want to sleep, have somebody read you a book of records, right? But it just so happens under God's providence that the records he read were of Mordecai thwarting the plot to have him killed. And so now the next day comes, and Haman comes to see the king. And we go down to verse 6. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delighted to honor, let the royal apparel be brought, which is the king used to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is upon his head. So Haman, being the puffed up person he is, thinks the king's going to honor him. And he says, hey, basically, give me all the best things you got. Let me wear your best clothes. Let me get on your best horse. Take me to the city on a big old parade so everybody can bow down to me, right? Maybe he's hoping Mordecai bow down to him. But as Haman soon finds out, this party, this celebration is not for him. Go down to verse 10 and we'll see what it's really for. Then the king said to Haman, make haste and take the apparel and the horse as thou hast, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. So here the king says, everything you just told me, do it for that guy that the king doesn't know that Haman hates, that Haman wants to kill. And so, this is the turn of events here, right? Haman has to hate this, as we're going to find out in a minute. So he does. So Haman does everything. And then if we look over to chapter 7, we're going to see more of what happens here. And this is another audio, so just read along. It's only about 10 verses of chapter 7 here.
So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he? And where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. And Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified.
So that's chapter 7. So Esther has that second feast, and she tells the king. The king says again, hey, I'll give you half of this kingdom. What do you want? And that's when she tells him, Haman is trying to kill us. Kill all of my people. And so, of course, the king gets very upset and walks out of the room. Then he comes back in and he sees Haman begging, whatever he was doing, it's not very clear, but it seems to be that he's begging Esther on Esther's bed for mercy, whatever. The king then gets very upset, and if you see in verse, I think it's verse 9 there, where the chamberlain reminds the king, hey, guess what? Those gallows he built to kill Mordecai, they're still out there. Maybe you can use them. And the king says that great line, I love the way that guy says that, hang him thereon. So they go and they hang Haman, the man who wanted to kill all of the Jews. So now we have the triumph of the Jews. We saw Haman's fate in Esther 7. Let's see. So then after this happens in chapter 8, we see all the things that that happened to the Jews that are God's great blessing. So go over to Esther 8:1, chapter 8. On that day did King Ahasuerus give the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told them what he was unto her. So here Esther reveals, hey, this is basically my father. He's my cousin. Mordecai is my father. He's the one who raised me after my parents died. And so they end up, Esther and Mordecai get the house that Haman was in. And then she reminds him, if you go down to verse 4, I'm not doing a good job with this tonight. If you go down to verse 4, you see that Esther now goes and she appeals to the king saying, hey, that order you had out there is still out there to kill all the Jews. So we see in verse 4 and 5 of chapter 8. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it please the king, and I have found favor in his sight, and the things seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's provinces. So really, kings couldn't really rescind an order. It was like just, if you put an order out there and you went back on it, that was pretty much frowned upon. So the king had to go make a different order that would still be effective. And so what he basically does is he says in verse 10 that he issues a counter decree that lets them defend themselves. Esther 8:10, and he wrote in King Ahasuerus' name and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by the post on horseback, and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries, wherein the king granted the Jews which are in every city to gather themselves together, and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take spoil for them for a prey. So here he says, you can defend yourself. If they attack you, come defend yourself. They were going to defend themselves anyway, but now it's known they can absolutely defend themselves. And so if you go down to verse 17, I see something here that I like a lot. Verse 17. And in every province and every city, whatsoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. The way I see here is I think that, I got it up there, many Gentiles may have been converted here. Because they are coming and they're becoming like the Jews. They're following the Jews' teaching, which at this time was to follow the God of the Old Testament. And so I think many people probably were converted. I think that's part of the thing that's telling us here, that they were converted. And so that's probably one of the great things that happened, where many people came to know the Lord, I think. Then we see that, again, these battles are still going on. Just because he rescinded that decree, there are still people going out there wanting to kill the Jews. Because, hey, they got an excuse. The king said I can do it. So that's what they're out doing. So if we look at verse 9, verse 2, chapter 9, verse 2 says, Then the Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the province of King Ahasuerus, to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them. For the fear of them fell upon all people. If we go down to verse 10, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they. But on the spoil laid they not their hands. Here, all of Haman's sons are killed in these battles. And we can also go down to verse 13. We see again, Esther is pleased with the king. Then said Esther, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow also according unto this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. And the king commanded it to be done. And the decree was given at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan, but on the prey laid not their hand. Then they've had this huge celebration. If we look down at verse 17 of verse 9, on the 13th day of the month Adar, and the 14th day of the same rested they, and made a day of feasting and gladness. Verse 27, then the Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such joined themselves unto them, so as it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days according to their writings, according to their appointed every year. And that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them that perished from their seed. So this is the festival of Purim. This happened over 2,000 years ago. The amazing thing, this festival still happens every single year in celebration of this event that we just read in the book of Esther. In fact, this year it happened at the end of February. I think last year was into March. So usually this happens between the end of February and the beginning of March. Over 2,000 years this celebration is going on. There aren't many things that happen these days that go on for that many years, especially to honor really what the Lord did. Now, who knows what this festival is like now, but if they truly remember what it's about, I sure hope they do, that the Lord was there and he helped free the Jews. So then Mordecai, if you look at verse 3, also says, for Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people and speaking peace to all his seed. So Mordecai is now basically second in command. He's basically taken Haman's position. But of course the people love Mordecai, because here he saved them, he helped to save them and bring them from being slaughtered. Him and Esther, and of course that was all through the grace of God. So what can we learn from Esther? That's only 10 chapters there. So do we really think, first of all, God's sovereignty over his creation? Do we really think that Esther, who didn't have a motherly figure in her life, parents died at a young age, raised by her cousin, just happened to be the person that would be who the king picked, just so happened all these things came together? Mordecai just happened to be in the right place at the right time to hear these people plotting to kill the king. The king happens to have the record read to him the day before Haman's going to come and tell Mordecai, or tell the king to kill Mordecai. He just happens to read the night before, and he's going to honor Mordecai. These things did not happen by chance. This is all God's providence. And on the story goes. Many things happening here that were all because of God's providence. God protects his children. Because God put Esther in this kingdom, and the king had great favor with him, they were able to be protected by the king and not kill the Jews. God rewards the faithful. That's very clear here, right? Mordecai and Esther were faithful Jews who would not bow down to the wicked Haman. And God rewarded them again and gave them great honor. God is always there. The word God may not be in this entire book, but he's there. The word may not be there, but it's extremely clear God is there. And then lastly, God can use anyone to accomplish his purpose. He used Esther, who again had no real motherly figure in her life, raised by Mordecai. And the Bible says he treated her like his own daughter. God used these people to ensure that the Jews would be protected and that the wicked Haman's plot would not prevail. God can and will use anyone, and he has a purpose in your life. Maybe it's not like Esther's purpose, but perhaps one day you may have to say, if I lose some friends, I lose some friends. Or maybe if I lose my job, I lose my job. Or maybe there could be a time when you end up to make a decision like Esther did, and you say, if I perish, I perish. But oh, to have the faith of Esther and Mordecai. That's all I had. So it's all you, John.
Well, thank you, Greg Carroll. A great